Hello everyone, and welcome to week 5 of Consumption, Work and the Self. Today I'm going to end up with talking about aesthetic and emotional labour, but before I get there, I'm going to set the scene a bit by talking about contemporary workplaces. Workplaces have changed quite significantly over time, and that might be a conversation you could have with parents and grandparents. And then what I'm going to do is introduce some sociological terms for work that we do that might never get recognised as work that we do. And if you're working in retail, you're probably already doing emotional labour, which is managing your own feelings in order for the customer to feel very good. Whether you get paid for that work or recognised for it is a different matter. But first up, I want to talk about the context in which we're working now, often thought of as post-Fordism.
Already be familiar with the idea of post-Fordism, a particular way in which we're working now, and Taylorism, the idea that we're all kind of now entrepreneurs of ourselves. And if you think back to our discussion about LinkedIn, where we had to brand ourselves and present in a particular way, a particular professional way, that sort of comes under the ideas that we're all kind of running a personal business of ourselves in this day and age. And as I said, emotional labour and a concept of aesthetic labour where you're tying up your physical appearance to match the brand of a company. And again, you might not be recognised for that work that you're doing or paid for it. And I also want to think about some of the social meanings of dressing for work, and that ties very much then into the readings that we're doing for this week. We're thinking about social hierarchy and thinking about positioning ourselves in the social hierarchy according to what we're wearing. And we're thinking about self-presentation. Who might be two theorists that we've already talked about who are really key in this area? Goffman and Bourdieu, two quite key theorists in this particular area. So the current working context is often called these days a fairly precarious one. When my dad had a job for 40 years in the one organisation, and that was seen as quite standard. That's no longer seen as standard, that you would go along and have a job in the one organisation, maybe work your way up as my dad did, but in the one organisation for a long, for perhaps your whole career, and then get a watch or something when you've retired in recognition of that service. So that kind of idea has largely gone. There are people who still do that, but it's no longer an expectation. And so if you were a person who in the past went from job to job, you would be seen as not particularly reliable. And yet a person these days going from job to job, that's kind of normal. So we've had quite a shift in Australia and in other countries as well about what expectations are. Part of that context is because of something called neoliberalism, which is an idea that these days it's the market that rules everything, and we've talked a little bit about the market there. The market rules, and the market will solve everything as well. So we don't need to provide good welfare safety nets, even though in Australia they're better than in other countries. We should be able to go out to the market, and many organisations now outsource, including government. They literally go out to the market to tender, and then government services are provided by the private market, by the private enterprise, to us as taxpayers. This has been a feature of both the right and the left of politics, both the Liberal governments and Labor governments since the 1980s, since Paul Keating particularly in Australia, if you know your political history. And features are kind of low taxes and very much a declining welfare base. I know that when I was studying, my family was on Austudy, and we certainly were not wealthy. We were below the poverty line. But I think if you're on Austudy now, you're on even worse situation, and we're in a time where people are criticised very much for being on benefits. And that's part of this whole concept of neoliberalism. But there's also an expectation that there will be less government regulation, less interference, and I think we're seeing the ramifications of that. Probably talked a little bit about the deunionisation of the workforce as well. So we have very few people now who belong to unions. And there's lots of complicated reasons for that, one being some scandals within the unions over the years, but also because we don't necessarily work with lots of people in a workplace anymore and talk about working conditions, more likely to be saying hello and goodbye to workers rather than working collaboratively. So we're not talking and fostering the idea of unions. So that union representation now across the country is down to about 11%. I think it's about 11% here at the university. Therefore, workers don't have as much say in the workplace. You know, it's the time of the employers. It's the employers who have pretty much the power at the present time. I think there's a bit of awakening around the place. I can hear the ACTU ramping up some campaigns, but very much there's a sense of, and this is part of the precarity of the workforce, that we feel as if it's the employers who have the power. Certainly it's not equal, and certainly it's not the workers. A real important feature of liberalism and neoliberalism, and neo just means new, so it's a new version of something that was happening earlier, particularly very early in the 19th century and with the big wave of industrialisation. So there's a sense of individual success and failure. So and it's because of what you've done, not any of the social circumstances, particularly not in that sense that Bourdieu was talking about of habitus and how you can be facilitated. If you grow up in an upper-class socio-economic environment, then you go to the right schools, you get the right education, you're actually facilitated to keep on maintaining your position in the social hierarchy or going further up. If you have a neoliberal perspective, however, you won't recognise any of those benefits that you have. You'll see your success as about your hard work. And I'm not suggesting that people don't work hard. I'm sure that they do, but there are other factors involved as well. And therefore, people who aren't particularly successful, who do end up, for example, on the dole, they are then blamed for their failure, rather than, for example, the recognition that there is volatility in the market at the moment, that manufacturing has decreased, that jobs might not be as easy to get, or that you might need retraining because long-term work has disappeared. It's much easier, I think, to claim credit. Who wants to claim failure? But I think that people are blamed for where they end up. We're also in a time of what's called post-Fordism, and I guess I've alluded to that with the decline of manufacturing in Australia. So manufacturing requires working in factories, and that's been going offshore. So that work has now disappeared to other countries because labour prices were cheaper. So that can be that's a good and a bad thing depending on your position. But one of the costs of that, of course, is that work is no longer available in Australia. And we've ended up with two large car manufacturers in recent years, Toyota and Holden's, who have disappeared out of the country altogether. So there's a whole lot of manufacturing jobs that are no longer available. And it's called post-Fordism because we had this era of manufacturing. It was kind of the era of Ford, I guess, and the Ford motor car. And some of that is kind of social good. He set up, this guy Ford, wanted to manufacture cars cheaply so that the average American could afford to get out and visit their country and explore the country, whereas previous to that, cars were kind of made individually and they were very, very expensive. So it was only people who had money who could afford to do it. It was very much a luxury item. So in order to manufacture cars very cheaply, he set up assembly lines and he paid workers very, very well. And that was what we followed on here with, out of Elizabeth in particular, with Holden set up these big manufacturing plants. People were paid quite well, but a lot of that has gone now. The manufacturing's gone. Place of that is the service sector that has risen, and knowledge industry. So any industry which uses research, where you're studying anything. Certainly a lot of the professions that you're going into, they're all service and knowledge professions. Increased flexibility, very much a key feature of John Howard's Liberal government. And flexibility, I guess on the one hand, there's more increased flexibility for workers. Often, however, the flexibility seems to advantage the employers. So there's an idea of outsourcing now, which, as I said, governments now outsource lots of services to private enterprise, and lots of companies do that. So, and we are outsourced not just in Australia, but if you've ever run Telstra and you've spoken to somebody in India, then that's a function, that call centre function has been outsourced overseas. And again, often the reason for that is cheaper labour costs. There's been an increase in casual and contract staff, so any of you working casually at the moment? And does it suit you as a university student? Will it suit you when you've got a family? Maybe it will. But if you've got expenses and things like that, casual work doesn't always suit later on. And contract staff, anybody on a contract? We have lots of contract staff within the university, particularly our research staff, where you might have a contract for a year, maybe 5 years, which would be a really, really good contract. And then you don't know if you're going to have a job at the end of that. That can give you flexibility because you can move on to something else. It can also create a sense of insecurity as well. And workers these days have portfolios, and I'll come on to that a little bit more. These days there seems to be an emphasis on fit or alignment of employees to employers. So there's a worker commitment to the employer, but not necessarily to the employee. So you're expected to be loyal to your employer, fit, adjust to their values, etc. But if they do a restructure, that's no commitment to you at all. That's completely gone. And in many ways, and this comes into aesthetic labour, which I'll talk about, workers are supposed to literally embody the employer values and goals as well. So you physically represent the organisation. And just continuing with that, I'm not going to show that clip, the quality is not fantastic, but it does show the sort of Ford Motor Factory in the early days and how they worked very, very hard to make it very efficient, cost efficient. It was a decent place actually for workers to work as well because they got paid quite well. But they were very much focused on scientific ways of doing things, not she'll be right mate, as we might do here sometimes. Based on this guy called Frederick Taylor, I think his name is, who was one of the first management consultants. Yeah, Frederick Taylor. He was an American born in 1856 and a mechanical engineer. So he was a consultant in some of these factories in order to get the workers working as efficiently as possible so that because efficiency equaled productivity equaled profit, they could then make the cars as quickly and cheaply as possible. He had 4 principles, was to replace an idea of rule of thumb, which obviously comes from carpentry, so a bit of guesswork really is what that means, with scientific methods. So they would do lots of time and motion studies and understand how people moved, how much time they needed to work before they lagged and got tired, and in order to maximise workers' labour really in the factories. And he had an expectation that employees should be chosen and trained scientifically as well, again not haphazard, but do it in a systematic, rigorous systematic way, and provide very detailed instructions for employees as to what they're supposed to do. That's probably the beginning of the idea of the job description, and then have supervision for every employee. And then there would be specialisation, so it was also the beginning of specialisation within a workforce. I don't know whether you've worked for a very small company where you kind of get a chance to do everything versus working in a very large organisation where you do the same thing time and time again, so you specialise in something. So he was encouraging people, managers in particular, to not be on the shop floor alongside the workers. That was the workers' job. Their job was to go and do some of that time and motion study and learn how to get the most out of their workforce. These days, however, that sort of Taylorism is not just related to factories. If you've heard about KPIs, key performance measurements, that's a very similar idea. So we still have this idea of scientific and expert management, not just in factories, but widespread. And that leads to a lot of quantifying what you do. Do any of you work in retail where you get bonuses if you meet targets and things like that? So everything is quantified. You're not going to get away with working without the management knowing how many sales, etc., that you've put through. So everything's watched. So it's both quantified, but there's also a level of surveillance there as well. So you are literally monitored these days, and that's very widespread. That's not just in retail, that's not just in factories, that happens at the university. So how many publications I produce, that's all monitored, and the same with all of the academics as well. The point is that we've taken some of those factory ideas and made them really quite widespread across a number of sectors, industry sectors, whether that's factory or not, and whether it's knowledge and service, which still are quantified these days, looking at the numbers, and quite closely surveilled as employees. The idea of portfolio workers is actually something that was common to people in the arts. So if you're an artist, an actor, a musician, you would literally go from gig to gig. You would have no expectation of a permanent job unless you decided that you'd go for a permanent job and do your art on the side. But if your commitment was to your art, and the vast majority of musicians, for example, in Australia, all have portfolio careers, and there's lots of advantages to that because you can just do what you are most passionate about, and some of them just have some jobs on the side until they can make money out of doing that. So where it was something that was very common in the arts, it's now been extended to many fields of work as well. Workers often do have a portfolio career, sometimes for many years, sometimes for their entire life, and sometimes for a short period of time until you can get into secure permanent work if that's what you want. And there still is plenty of secure permanent work around. Sometimes it just takes a little bit of time to get into it. But it does include those of you presently working. You already have a portfolio career. You probably have gone from job to job and had some of that casual work and fixed term contract. It may mean that you work for several different companies at the same time, and certainly I've done that earlier on. I've worked at all 3 universities in an external organisation teaching, and you might work for several different clients. The features of this really is that it's analogous to running your own business, and for some people that's fantastic. For somebody like my husband, who's a social worker, he couldn't imagine working for somebody else, and I quite frankly can't imagine him working for anybody else either. He's a bit of a maverick, and he'd always put his mouth in it, and he wouldn't conform, and therefore he'd get sacked. He's always had this portfolio career, but for him that was just running your own business, and you just have various customers and clients and contracts, and that's just a fabulous thing. Not everybody likes it though, because there is no job security. It is your own business, so therefore you have to put your superannuation aside. You're not getting your sick leave benefits, you're not getting any annual leave, which you're not if you're a casual worker either. And therefore work becomes a series of projects. And as I said, for artists, yeah, that's fantastic. They really like it. Musicians, they really like it. People who don't want to be tied down, and it's a feature of some industries like IT, information technology as well, they do move from project to project. Suits lots of people, doesn't suit everyone. And therefore you can't really expect that linear career progression that might have happened in the past. And you may need to go where the work is. I know people in the construction industry, for example, who will go interstate when a contract runs out. They were free to go right across the country. And mining workers are very similar as well. Depending on the contract that you have, there can be reduced benefits. So that's a problem with it. Most people I know just want a nice permanent job that they can have for 5 to 10 years and then move on. But in reality that it may be something that you have to have for a little while that permanent job is opening up. And of course it is most difficult with those who do have commitments aside from themselves to family or to parents or whatever, because the work is not regular. You can't necessarily rely on it. The idea of the entrepreneurs of the self is that we're working on ourselves, and I've seen this happen since the 1980s in Australia, and we tend to follow trends from America. And the expectation is that we're always working on ourselves to become a better person and to be a better employee. And we want to present ourselves as the ideal worker, usually a positive thinker, risk-taking within the rules of the organisation, to be independent and self-reliant. They're the ideal worker. And our attitudes and our appearance and our personality should all line up to the company brand as well. So that's, if you're thinking of being an ideal worker, there's a few tips for that. And then we'll have our own personal brand identity, which we talked about a little bit, where you are investing in yourself all of the time. And you can do that in a number of ways through management training programs. They, of course, are a lot about employee compliance, and they will emphasise the desirable attitudes that you should have for your particular workplace, usually positive. Being angry at work, being negative at work, being critical at work are not usually seen as good things. And the emphasis there is on changing yourself, changing the less than desirable attitudes and behaviours so that you're conforming to the ideal worker in your workplace. Management will be trying to inspire innovation and change, and because there's a lot of change these days, that can all lead to what's called organisational change fatigue if there's a lot of change in a workplace. There is also this thriving self-help market. There's plenty of resources if you do want to cultivate and invest yourselves in ways to modify your behaviour. You can do workshops, there's heaps and heaps of books. These days you can go and see a life coach, and I know somebody who does that very productively. And there's also something called public pedagogy, which is a term coined by an American theorist called Henry Guru, and he reckons that reality television programs are really, pedagogy means teaching, are really public teaching programs. They're actually educating us on how we're supposed to be as ideal citizens, ideal workers, ideal entrepreneurs, depending on the show, ideal cooks. There's a reason for those television shows. They serve a function, and one of those functions, he says, is to teach us how to be. The idea of emotional labour was coined by a sociologist called Ali Hochschild, and she says this is the management of feeling to create a publicly observable facial and bodily display, lining up feelings often with the expectations of what an organisation wants you to be. She did a study with airline hostesses, and I don't know if you've ever observed airline hostesses, but they are invariably chirpy, happy, smiling, and that's what she thought was emotional labour. They might not actually be feeling that way, but that was a desired part of their work, because then they would put the customers, us, at ease, make us feel happy, etc. Whereas if they were grumpy, maybe, or if they were feeling nervous on a flight, then we might be feeling nervous, and that would not be good for anyone. So she talked about this as having an exchange value. We exchange our emotional work for money in the workforce, except that I'm not sure if it's always recognised as emotional labour and whether you get any bonuses for that additional work that you do. So it involves employees being required really to manipulate or even to fake your feelings. And I don't know whether you've ever done that, where you've had to go to work and put on a happy face, and it's very conscious, where it's a conscious performance thing. You're aware that you're not happy, but you do put on this performance. So you're manipulating or faking, I guess, your feelings to fit the job. It is emotional work then sold for money. It's the work that we do then to make customers feel good, to feel welcome, to feel comfortable, to feel relaxed, to feel as if they can talk with us, the whole idea about service with a smile. And what we're required to do when we're doing that sort of work is to repress emotions that are seen as negative. Disgust, for example, nurses have to repress feelings of disgust, which they would encounter quite a lot when they're cleaning up after people who vomited. The police is the same. Anybody in those sorts of professions where people are doing things that we might see as disgusting, and our instinct is to feel disgusted, they actually have to repress those feelings so that the person does not then feel ashamed and humiliated by what they've just done. Therefore, it is usually associated with the caring and the helping professionals. A psychologist, we've got any psychologists in training here? Nursing, social work, teachers. Anything you observe about any of those professions? They're actually, apart from high school teachers, they're all very woman-dominated. So it's actually not always recognised that emotional labour is a skill that we learn. Instead, it's often seen as natural for women. Women are seen as naturally more caring, more nurturing than men, and therefore it's not always picked up as a skill, which is probably why it's not always paid for or given a bonus, because it's just seen as something we naturally do. It is seen as increasingly important, and I've got a little bit of a clip to show you about that. We are supposed to contribute to a pleasant work environment, leave our personal problems at the door when we go to work, chit-chat with other people, remember birthdays, and these are called widely people skills or social skills or soft skills, and the soft skills is very much associated with the gendering of that. These are soft skills, and women are supposed to be softer and kinder than men. Because sometimes we might just be surface acting because we've gone to work, we are in a bad mood, something has happened at home, and we might be happy to be at work, but our emotions are still lagging behind there. She calls that surface acting. We're just surface acting. We are pretending, and we're aware that when we are pretending, sometimes your mood can shift through the pretending, but we're pretending, and that can have a cost, as opposed to deep acting, where we actually try to feel what you're required to display. So I do know people who are really bright and bubbly, and they're not surface acting when they're happy and joyous and happy to be with people, etc. They're just not. That really seems to be deep acting on their part, or part of who they are. Whereas for other people, it's the performance that they put on when they go to work, and then when they go home, they're not quite the same. Deep acting is when you try to feel what you're required to act out, and surface acting is where you know that you're acting and things are not good. Deep acting is the best thing if you're in a job where you're required to do that and you don't have to really act. You're trying to feel that anyway and it's working for you. There's a consonance between that versus a dissonance. So if you're required for a long period of time to surface act in a job that you're actually not happy in and you don't want to do it, that leads to a whole lot of repressed emotions and eventually to depression. So that can be the cost of that sort of work. And it pays to know that sort of job that you're going into. So I've been doing some work for Uniting Communities with youth workers, and they do so much emotional labour, youth workers do. They have to do work on themselves, and they have to do the emotional management of often de-escalating is the language they use, calming young people down who are acting out and angry and whatever. So they do a lot of that emotional labour. And if the management team isn't aware of that, then they won't put in place the required breaks that are needed for staff. They won't recognise the energy that goes into that. And so you're better off doing a job which fits for you emotionally rather than burn yourself out, because there's a lot of burnout associated with surface acting. So let's have a look at some of these organisational display rules, because every organisation will have its feeling rules.
Emotional labour is a type of labour similar to physical and cognitive labour. It's when we have to exert effort to express emotions at work, particularly when we're dealing with people outside of our work.
In many organisations, employees are expected to adhere to what is known as organisational display rules. These are expectations about the emotions that employees ought to display when interacting with customer, clients or patients.
The types of careers that involve a lot of emotional labour are those careers where you spend a lot of time interacting with people outside the organisation. So nurses or police officers, parking attendants or customer complaint officers are typical of the kinds of jobs that involve emotional labour. We know from the literature and from our own research that there are broadly two ways in which people can approach their emotional labour. We think of those as being surface acting and deep acting.
Surface acting is when you display emotions that you don't genuinely feel, either by faking emotions or suppressing emotions or amplifying emotions. Deep acting is when you try to genuinely feel the emotions that you ought to display, such as taking the perspective of another person and trying to feel what they feel.
In our research, what we found is that when people use surface acting strategies, it's much more detrimental to work outcomes. They feel much worse at work because it's very difficult to maintain two types of emotions at the same time. It becomes emotionally exhausting very quickly. What we also know is that it starts to affect how you feel about your work and how you feel about yourself. On the other hand, when you're deep acting, because you've managed to realign your emotions and you're using genuine emotions in your interaction, it means that the response from the other person is much more genuine and much more positive. And so you then feel reinforced or rewarded for the effort you've put in. And that means that you feel genuinely more committed to the role, you feel genuinely that you're doing a good job. And that has an impact on your performance and also on your well-being at work. So what is the impact of emotional labour on absenteeism? We've calculated, based on our research in hospitals, that for a small to medium-sized hospital to replace the additional time that nurses take as sick leave due to using strategies that are not very effective is about 100,000. So that's a significant impact on a bottom line for a small organisation over a year.
It's important for us to be aware of the impact that emotional labour has on individuals in terms of their well-being, and also the impact that emotional labour has on organisational outcomes, including bottom line outcomes, because then we'll be able to create a more sustainable workforce where people are able to be engaged and productive at work.
I think that it's a really important thing to think about the sorts of work that you do want to do and whether you are suited, and to think about the emotional requirements of the work as well, so that you don't have to do the surface acting. Aesthetic labour is another concept similar to that, but it's around embodiment. If we think about the word embodiment, combines kind of our physical body, our senses, our experience of the world biologically. So there's that. But you've got to add on to that the whole lot of the socio-cultural ideas that are accumulated and written or inscribed on the body as well. So ideas around gender, race, sexuality, etc. So how is it that we know when we're looking at somebody that they're a man and a woman? It's because it's written, literally written on the body. Think about hairstyles, earrings, clothes that we wear, etc. It's written on the body. Another concept that I wanted to talk about is about commodification, the transforming of goods, services and even people then into tradable objects. So employees contribute to a distinctive brand of a company. They literally add value. Whether they get paid for that is another thing. The idea of aesthetic labour is that, so it is about your appearance, spending the money on an aesthetic. Employees become literally commodities when they embody the values, the service, the product that is being sold, when they look and sound right for a particular organisation, and when they project the right image that aligns with the company image. One of my observations when I used to work for IBM was that people would start working in the company and they just looked like anybody on the street. But by the time they'd been there for a year or so, maybe a little bit longer, they started to embody the corporate ideals and values, particularly if they wanted to rise in the company. If they didn't embody the image, they weren't going to get a promotion. So they would start to wear more corporate outfits, pinstripe suits back in those days, so that they looked the part. So I would observe that happening, but I also remember hiring somebody when I was in a management position because I could see immediately that she looked the part. I kind of think back on that now and go, oh my God. But she did. She looked as if she would fit the corporation, and that had nothing to do with her skills or technical knowledge or anything like that. She literally looked the part. And so if you think about reception staff, they do aesthetic labour as well as emotional labour. Staff who were very stylish and confident, they fit the brand, which involves, of course, a lot of grooming. And for some people, that's fantastic. And I'm going to come to another concept in a minute called appearance labour, where it doesn't always work for everyone. And it is about wearing the right dress, the earrings, etc. And then it's also about body shape too. Very large bodies are not welcome. They're not seen as fitting many of the corporate brands. It's not about qualifications, it's not about skills, it's not about technical knowledge, it is about looking. And this is the work of Lynn Pettinger, who talks about the gendering then of lots of customer service as work as well. And she acknowledges the emotional labour, but she's also interested in this idea of aesthetic labour as well. And the segregation of men and women, if you think of McDonald's. I haven't been there for a long time, so maybe it's changed, but usually it's the women out the front and the guys are out the back doing the cooking, and that's part of the aesthetic labour of having the women doing that sort of emotional labour and the aesthetic labour out the front. And then the gendering of products that are being sold, which of course just reflect wider macro ideas about gender. In the retail industry, clothing, we've discussed this before, clothing is gendered. It also reflects social status and social identities. And the body then becomes a link between production of clothing and consumption of clothing in retail stores. And in retailing a gendered product, for example, women's clothing, is sold in a gendered environment, and usually by, particularly in smaller shops or in DJs, by a feminised workforce, making use of skills that are seen as feminised, applying makeup, doing hair, self-presentation, etc. And the store brands then reflect different ways of being feminine and different levels of cultural capital, summed up, of course, in the different cultural capital between Kmart, shopping at Kmart and shopping at David Jones. Christine Williams and Catherine Connell in the States were looking at this as well, because they reckon aesthetic labour has to do with the reproduction of inequality, and again, using Bourdieu's work. So the embodied form of the sales assistant equals the brand of the store. They talk about high-end stores, how they want the right look, the right aesthetic. So middle class usually, conventionally gendered and typically white. So in other words, what they're looking for is female staff who actually come from the right habitus to fit that high-end store, and therefore the customers who are coming in. They reckon that that's a part of that reproduction of inequality, because that's not going to give opportunities to women who come from a lower socioeconomic basis. They're going to just reproduce the inequality and pass on jobs to people from the same habitus. They reckon you can save on training, because you're going to hire class privileged workers who already know how to speak, walk, talk, have the right conversation, etc. So you don't have to train them to do that. They've already been trained from birth in that sort of Bourdieu concept. Hiring people who already shop, probably at that shop as well. Therefore, they're the right size and they're likely to be passionate about the brand. In their study, what the hiring staff would do was keep the interview going for a little while so that they could suss out the habitus that the person had come from. So they knew they were hiring not from the low end, but from the high end as well. So they would check out, do the sort of Adelaide thing, like what school did you go to, etc. And then they would be offering discount off the store products because they could assume that workers didn't necessarily need the wages, and need the wages in terms of supporting a family or having to pay the rent, but often these workers were still living at home and could do this, that was kind of luxury items really for them. However, the other point that they make is that this consumer pleasure from going to these shops and working in these shops, and there would be a good fit, not much training and not much learning to do, because that all seems quite natural, leads to less resistance by workers to substandard conditions. And they were saying that these jobs in the United States are actually bad jobs. They're usually casual work, they're very, very lowly paid, and I think minimum wages in the United States are far lower than in Australia. Also, there was job segregation, so that they reckon there was this sorting of jobs along the lines of gender, but also on the basis of race and class. This fetishism then of consumption as well, so that the social relations of production become obscured. So the fact that we might go into a Nike store and don't understand that Nike shoes are being manufactured by children in Vietnam is part of obscuring the social relations of production. We become very, very removed from it. Advertising, of course, increases desire, and workers then become a part of what is purchased. They're the brand representatives. And as I said, those bad jobs are invisible. What Williams and Connell conclude is that those who shop at upscale stores may think that they're simply expressing their superior judgment and taste, but really they're announcing and legitimising their place in a social hierarchy, I should say, up the top. I wanted to talk a little bit about the social meanings of work, particularly the difference between being conservative and fashionable, and because this has more implications for women than it does for men. So conservative has connotations of stability, fashionable being flexible, maintaining status quo for conservative, being open to change if you're open to fashion, traditional versus awareness of what's going on, classic versus being able to combine the classic and the trendy. The professional is on the side of conservative, very similar to a male business image, muted styles, not lots of colours. If you go too far, though, with conservative, then you end up looking just out of date. If you go too far with being fashionable, you can be labelled as an exhibitionist. Now, this will also apply to men. It seems to have lots of implications for women going into previously male-dominated professions, as the readings were talking about. Conformity and creativity. The values of conformity are about sharing the values and success of the business, going along with that. You can fit in with a group, and that fitting in often means fitting in with men, because many industries are still dominated by men. Whereas if you're in a creative industry, you're more able to express your personality and individuality, and evidence of your creativity is welcome, it's expected. Again, if you go too far when it comes to conforming, then you lose your individual identity, and if all the employees are conforming, then they're just interchangeable. You can just replace one employee with another. If you go too far at the creative end, then of course you're an eccentric or a maverick, and you're probably going to get sacked at some point. Masculinity and femininity is important because most of the professions have been male-dominated, and particularly the prestigious oldest ones like law and accounting, which is the ones that we're talking about. So masculinity, if this is about women going too far again, we can dress similarly to men, and that's okay, with a basic sort of suit, dark suits, making sure that the body is covered is a professional image. Feminine dress is okay as well. It's nice, soft, flowy fabrics, etc. If you're looking more masculine, then you do look as if you're ready for business. That's the social meanings. But that femininity is often appreciated in business as well. It looks like you're very competent, you're ready to perform. That having that really feminine look is appreciated as well, because for many people it means you're not denying your sex, and so that's seen as a good thing. But if you go too far in picking up some of the male costume, then you're violating a gender norm. And if you go too far on the feminine side, then you'll be seen as too frivolous, you won't be taken seriously, or too sexy, and that's the same thing.
This is a visual representation of what I've just been talking about. There is an ideal business image for women, and if women go too far, if they conform too much, if in a creative industry they're too creative or too expressive, if we adopt male suits, which is not uncommon at all, then we can, in the danger zone, the danger is that we would violate gender norms. Danger zone means that women lose credibility. Now, I'm aware that this research was done some time ago, back in the 1990s, and I think it would be interesting, therefore, to have a conversation and see whether the range of acceptability for women now is a little bit broader than it used to be. Again, with research from the 1990s, that we should consider whether any of this has shifted or not. The researchers take up these ideas of social meanings of dressing for work, and they've coined this term the imperative of attractiveness, which actually has money or economic value in the workplace, and it's often required of men too, but men have a little bit more latitude. I'm not sure if that's shifted. It seems to me it might have shifted so that men have a little bit less latitude these days. So I'd be keen to hear your views on that. So when I mean social meanings of dressing for work, say if somebody's overweight, that then is interpreted as meaning that they don't have much self-respect or they don't have much in the way of self-worth. And then that's interpreted again socially as meaning that they won't be conscientious at work. So then it becomes an undesirable trait for people. Similarly, if people aren't into grooming, well, if it's not something that they're really interested in, then that equates to the social meaning of that. It's interpreted as a lack of self-respect, a lack of self-worth, and then in turn, that's interpreted as a lack of conscientious. When it comes to hierarchical workplaces, then the higher you are in the workplace, in the business, the corporation, the university or whatever, then the more conservative you will be required to dress. So it's very unusual, at least at the University of Adelaide, to see our Vice-Chancellor and our executive management team not in a suit or dressed in a very conservative way. I did notice there might be some differences. So I noticed when I went to a meeting at the University of South Australia, then the Vice-Chancellor there was a little less conservative, but that'll come to a little point that I make later on. So the higher you are, the more conservative you'll dress, more likely to be in a suit, etc. And the lower, more casual wear is accepted, more in the idea of business casual. However, the researchers say those who are high up can take more liberties. So that's the example there of David Lloyd over at the University of South Australia. He could, if he wanted to, and seems to take a few more liberties and relax and be themselves. And the examples I've got there is Steve Jobs. When he was around, he only ever wore jeans and t-shirts, I think, and Mark Zuckerberg. The higher you are, you have the opportunity for more self-expression, and you can increase your norm violations because you have more power in the workplace, and so therefore the consequences are far less for you. This is an example of boardroom formal, so going to the highest level in an organisation, the governing bodies, the boards, going along to one of those meetings, then you would be required usually to dress in quite a conservative way. And you can see in the example there how once women have got into the boardroom, then the requirement is that they adopt in many ways masculine dress. As I've said before, when it comes to the creative industries or design industries, then it's perfectly okay to be less conforming and less conservative and adopt more individualistic styles, because that's evidence of your creativity, and creativity is exactly what a client wants. And the final term that I want to talk about is the idea of appearance labour. So this is the work that has to go into your appearance if there's an incongruence between your self-identity and your work identity. So if you're a jeans and t-shirt sort of person, but you work in a very conservative workplace and need to wear a suit, then that's what I mean by that incongruence or mismatch between what you'd prefer and what you have to do. So it's a dissonance between what individuals believe that they're expected to wear and what they would prefer to wear. And that's work that we have to do and can be experienced as oppressive and harmful in the long term. So this lack of congruence or fit between role identity, performance, and internal identity can actually result in a loss of self-esteem. So a mismatch between the individual's privately felt authentic self and its public performance is experienced as alienating and even humiliating for some people. So some examples that I thought of was, if you don't want to conform to rigid gender norms, then that's incongruence. If you've got tattoos and piercings, but you need to hide those in the workplace, again, that's incongruence. Any sort of markers of working class identity is usually stigmatized. And the same with markers of religion. So for example, if you wanted to wear a hijab, but that's not okay in the workplace, then that's an example of that incongruence, and therefore of an indication of the appearance labour that you have to put into getting dressed for work. Summary: what we've been talking about today is a decline in manufacturing and a rise in what's called the knowledge economy. We're now entrepreneurs of ourselves and responsible for our own brands and for our self-promotion, for example, via LinkedIn. Many people will have what's known as a portfolio career rather than staying in one organisation for an extended or for their entire lives. And there's a whole lot of labour for which you might not get paid. You might not get paid for the emotional, aesthetic and appearance labour that you do. Thank you for listening.